and the broadcast.
It's a good-looking group.
It is.
Your bar is low. And thank you for that.
And just to be clear, I was talking about on the slide.
Well, Eugenia looks her live that she does in her photo. I just want you to know that.
Oh boy, Rob, thank you for that. But I'm going to fire the photographer.
Folks, if you're joining us, we're just letting everyone take a moment to get settled. We will start in just a moment. And feel free to say hi in the chat. I always love seeing where everyone's from.
It's Matt Brooks. Good morning.
Hey,
Matt, Mr. Oregon Pinot Noir in the house.
There are awards coming his way.
Any news on the Death Watch today, Matt? If you're a friend of Matt's on Facebook, he always knows, like, he's the first person that you'll hear from about some famous person passing away.
He is. That's where I get my news. Like Matt's
Yeah.
Facebook feed. Yeah. All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to Preview Week for Willamette, the Pinot Noir auction. The 2019 Willamette Valley wines featured in this tasting series are exclusive small lot bottlings for our wine trade auction. If you don't know about the auction and you'd like to learn more about how to purchase these wines, you can contact Emily at the WVWA, and I dropped her email address in the chat. I'd like to take a moment to thank all of our auction sponsors for their ongoing support. And a very big special thank you to our Imperial sponsor, Winebow. And now I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Representing Lot 74, Claire Jarreau of Brooks. Representing Lot 75, Bill Sweat of Winderlea. Representing Lot 76, Rob Stuart of our Stuart and Company. Representing Lot 77, Ben Casteel of Bethel Heights. Representing Lot 78, David Paige of David Paige Wines.
Hello.
Representing Lot 80, Gary Horner of Erath. And your moderator for today, Eugenia Keegan of Jackson Family Wines. Eugenia, they're all yours.
Julia, thank you. This is day 5 of Preview Week, and I feel like we are the honored end of the relay race, and we get to pick up the baton last and carry it over the finish line today. This is lucky group 13, and I hope they're as lucky as the number would imply. Julia, how are you holding up?
I'm doing great, Eugenia. This is my Super Bowl week.
And you're not the only one who's been here for every one of these. We have some people in the audience that have been with us for every one of these. Thank you very, very much. One of the things that I love about this particular auction is the way it focuses on a single vintage. It's really easy to talk about these wines as a unified expression of the Willamette Valley, because we are talking about one vintage. And for those of you who have been here all week, I apologize if this is a bit of a redo. And for those who are new, I wanted to just take a moment to talk about the 19 vintage. It was a very refreshing vintage for those of us who have been here making wine for years. We, as you know, have had some warm years, and 17 started to cool off, 18 got warm again. But lovely 19 came in with some, believe it or not, rain, and we actually like that. So we had a very interesting winter in that the fall, late fall and into the early winter was reasonably warm and moderate, but the early spring turned very cold and wet, and that's unusual. We've had a lot of warm springs, and that particular year we had a cool to cold spring. And then we had a couple frost opportunities, and we had some intermittent rain early on. but we didn't have any of the heat spikes that we often get in the summer. And so we had a much sort of cooler period from April through August. And we only saw a few days over 90 and 1 or 2 over 95. And so it wasn't really a particularly warm summer. It was mild. And then, of course, we had some wonderful rain in September, 3 or 4 little sprinklings that really put us on attention. And then we actually had quite a cold October. I know we finished on October 17th, and those last couple of weeks, we had those extra jackets on. So really beautiful finish, cool finish to that vintage. And although we literally weathered, no puns intended, some rain in September, we had an absolutely spectacular finish to the vintage with a lot of luxury of time of picking. So with that introduction, we're going to move on to something far more interesting, which is hearing from our august panelists. And we're going to go in numeric order because usually between numbers and alphabet, I usually don't get confused. That's about, those are 2 things I'm pretty secure on. I actually, when I lay out my wines and I have 5 or 6 wines and I have to put them in some order, I put them in alphabetical order because no matter how much I drink, I don't think I've forgotten my alphabet yet. It's, there's time, there's plenty of time, but that's my little secret method. So we're going to start with lot number 74, and that is Brooks. And we have Claire Jarreau with Jarreau, excuse me, like Al, Claire Jarreau. Thank you for that, Claire, to talk to us about Brooks and her role at Brooks and a little bit about Brooks. If you could take it away for us, Claire.
Thank you, Eugenia. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining us on what seems to be like it will be another warm day in the Willamette Valley. My name is Claire Jarreau, and I have been with Brooks Winery for going on 7 years. And my role here is associate winemaker, but I also manage all of our vineyard relationships. We do farm 20 acres ourselves biodynamically in the Ola Hills, but we also source from about 30 other vineyards scattered throughout the Willamette Valley and the Columbia River Gorge area. So in being here for the last 6 years, as Eugenia said, the 2019 vintage for me was really refreshing. I kind of went into the year thinking, after numerous warm seasons and being in charge of picking decisions, that I had kind of developed a playbook or an idea of how things were going to go for the harvest and what order our vineyards were going to come in, give or take a few exceptions. And then 19 just was the perfect refresher and just shook things up and really brought about a new set of cards for me that I hadn't really seen since maybe 2010 and 11 when I first started making wine in the Willamette Valley. So it was a really fun vintage for me. I was super excited to make these wines and excited to share them with you all.
So Old Salt is the name of your wine, and it comes, tell us a little about that, would you?
Sure. So the 19 Old Salt is really named after kind of 2 things. Part of that is the salinity that we're picking up in the wine, and we really enjoy. The wine has sort of this like sanguine kind of like rich character that provides just this savory tone overall to the wine that we really like. Secondly, it's named after the 2 characters who farm the vineyards that are adjacent to ours. So just below our hill on the east side of the Ola Hills, we have Dick Crannell's vineyard, and it's been planted since 1984. The entire vineyard is own-rooted. And so part of the blend is 84 planted, own-rooted old vine pomard. Another good portion of the vineyard, the blend is from a vineyard across the street named Musca, which is owned by Carl Musca. And Carl Musca was a former sailboat racer in his day, and I kind of think of him as an old salt. So the 2 are really close and near and dear to our hearts here, and make up a huge portion of our production annually every year, but we've never blended the 2 sites on their own specifically for a special cuvee. So we decided to do that this year and highlight them and what all that they bring to us as a winery and their unique sites. They are very different sites, even though they're just across the road from each other. Dick's site is very restrained, has remarkable acid retention, lots of complexity. And then Carl's site is a little bit younger vine and has vibrancy and lots of fruit and lusciousness. So the 2 interplay really well together. And I think that all those components come together in the 2019 Old Salt.
So you mentioned that you are farming biodynamically. How long has that been going on at Brooks?
So Brooks has been biodynamic since 2012 certified, but Jimmy Brooks, who founded the winery in '98, started the conversion on the property here in 2002. I think by 2004, Chris Williams has had to take the helm over, and he fully converted the vineyard by that year, along with Jimmy, right before Jimmy passed away, actually. So fully converted since 2004, certified since 2012. The winery is also certified fully since 2014. So it's really been at the core of what we've been doing since nearly the beginning.
That's great. That's super. Thank you, Claire, so much. Great to have you on this panel today. We're going to move to lot number 75, and that is the Winderlea lot. And we have Bill Sweat with us, who's the proprietor, along with his wife, Donna, of Winderlea. And I wish I were tasting this wine right now, Bill, but I will be by your barrel because I've known this vineyard for a long time, and you call your wine Own Roots. And it is one of the first established vineyards up in the Dundee Hills. So tell us a little about Winderlea and about this wine, if you would, Bill.
Thank you very much, Eugenia. And thank you all for joining us today. It's always a treat to do these events. My wife, Donna Morris, and I founded Winderlea in 2006. That was our first harvest. We bought what had previously been the Goldschmidt Vineyard, and prior to that, the Dundee Hills Vineyards, which was first planted in 1974. And so the Marsh Vineyard next door to us, which was planted in 1970, I think might be the oldest Pinot Noir on Warden Hill Road, where we're located. And our vineyard came in sometime after, a few years after that. You know, we've always loved this vineyard. Actually, before we were in the industry, it was our favorite vineyard in Oregon. And it's just serendipity that we somehow managed to land on it ourselves. And so this particular wine is from two of the oldest blocks on the vineyard, and it's always special to work with those 1970 era plantings.
So then maybe I have the youngest vineyard on Warden Hill.
I
I think maybe we're bookends then, Bill. That's really great. Yeah, it won't be for long. I'm sure somebody will come behind and plant again. I didn't know that you were familiar with that vineyard really before you got out here. And I know that I watched Adelsheim Vineyard make, and Paige can respond to this because he probably made those wines over at Adelsheim, the old Goldschmidt wines. But even today, those wines, if you're lucky enough to pull one out of your cellar, they're just glorious wines. So that's just a fabulous site. So thank you for sharing that for your V19 auction wine. I'm not sure everybody gets to taste that.
It is an amazing site, I can attest. In fact, I thought when I read the notes, did this come from that block that we used to get at Adelsheim?
There's a bit of it that does come from that block, and Adelsheim still does get half of that block. And I should point out to our guests that the bottom part of the vineyard was laid out by David Adelsheim. It was planted to a kind of a hodgepodge of things that weren't doing terribly well, and when it was acquired by Neil Goldschmidt, he asked for some help from David, and David redesigned the bottom 2/3 of that property. So I have him to thank for the beautiful fruit we're getting from that section of the property.
Well, and you're kind enough to continue to sell him some fruit. So it's one of those really beautiful quid pro quos. So everybody wins. Thank you, Bill.
One last quick comment about that block. People like to talk about vine age and how important it is, but that block made a reserve tier wine the first year bore fruit. It was delicious from the get-go.
Huh, interesting observation. Yeah, we do reference that old vine and assume that we're going to get something more impressive, but to your point, Dave, it's all about the site. I don't know how often we come, if you're making wines a place, and that's what we do, and we come back to that phrase, over and over and over again. Next up on lot number, I have to do all my references, 76. Rob, I don't want to call you an old timer around here because you're not old enough to be an old timer, but you have been around the Willamette for a long time, and you have such a wonderful story, and your lot here is a tribute to that wonderful story and your history here. And I look forward to hearing this story right from you, Rob.
Right from me. Well, Rob Stuart from our Stuart & Co. winery. Good morning, good afternoon to those of you east of us. And I'm sort of the half blood. Ben was 2 years old when I met him, and I was hiding eggs for his family, and he hears this all the time. So there were what I call pioneers, and actually when I worked for Dick Erath, he said, I hate the name pioneer because pioneers are dead people, and Dick Erath is still alive, but
and kicking.
Kicking. I kind of came into the world of Oregon when people started their wineries and they made their own wine, and the concept of actually having a winemaker was, you just didn't have that. And so early on, actually, when I was working for Dick Erath, he refused to call me the winemaker. But I went on a trip to Atlanta for him along with my wife Maria, and Dick, if you know Dick Erath, he was very tight with money, very cautious with it, and he had pre-purchased some tickets to Atlanta, but you had to stop in Denver, and it was a time when you had to identify yourself if you had a ticket. And Gary, you can relate to this, I'm sure. Oh, yeah. And Dick said, "Oh, just get on the plane. Check in at the curb and get on the plane, and you'll be fine." And we got to Denver, and we're sitting at the gate, and then they said, "We're going to require identification for everybody that is getting on the plane." And Maria and I looked at each other and I was like, "What the hell are we going to do?" So we got up to the gate. We're the last ones to get on the plane, and we said, "We're not Dick and Joan Erath. We're busted." And so the counter clerk got on the phone with Dick Erath, and Dick was upset with them, but he said, "You got my winemaker stuck in Denver." And I said, "Oh my God, I've arrived. I'm a winemaker now." So that's one of many Dick Erath stories. My wife and I started this winery in 20 years ago, almost 21 years ago, after me making wine in the Northwest. For the most part, Oregon. I started in Southern Oregon in '81. I worked in the Yakima Valley from '85 to '94, and I call that an incarceration. And if you've ever lived in Yakima, you would understand that. And then worked for Dick Erath until 2001, and in 2001 is when we started our own production. So that's my history. And you probably want to know why this is called Vivian, and it's truly a tribute to Vivian Weber. Vivian and her husband Arthur, who passed away a number of years ago, have an interesting history. And first of all, their property is contiguous with the property that Donna and Bill own at Winderlea. And Vivian just turned 80 the other day. She doesn't look 80 at all. And she told me the story, and I won't tell you the whole story, but basically Arthur was selling, I think, math books or some sort of textbooks. And Vivian was taking people around the world on, she would tour people wherever. And Arthur decided that he wanted to buy property in the Dundee Hills, and he was looking for David Lett. Couldn't find David Lett. Nobody seemed to know where David Lett lived. And if you knew David Lett, that's kind of the way he liked it. But Arthur was driving up the street, the Dundee Hills Road, right near where Winderlea is, and saw a sign tacked on a tree, and it said property for sale, and they bought it. What's interesting is that they took everything they had and sold everything. They were living in Boston, and they were actually homeless for about a year. And they had a tent and they had some property, and that was it. And to me, that's some serious dedication. They planted their first block in '75, and unfortunately, after Arthur died, Vivian sold half of her vineyard to Andy Humphrey, who still manages the vineyard, and he ended up selling to Bill Horan. So the oldest blocks were sold off, but we had been buying fruit from this 1.1 acres of a 1985 planting of Pomar on its own roots. And it's interesting to watch it evolve because it was 9 years younger than the stuff that we were buying from the original blocks. And we're seeing that even though these two blocks are literally 12 feet apart, the 85 planting, which what's this wine is made from, is slowly becoming that older wine that is literally 12 feet away. So even though the aspect and the soil and everything is parallel, and it's the same clone because all they did was take cuttings of Pomar from the 75 planting and actually 76 planting and just took cuttings and planted the 85 planting. So I see a lot of spice in this wine, sort of dark berry kind of things going on, forest floor. We talk about these things all the time, but it's just interesting to watch the mouthfeel evolve to where it's more and more round like those older plantings. And Bill, I have not tasted your wine, but I suspect that's you get this without opening your eyes. You put this wine in your mouth, and it just becomes very round and lush.
Yeah, and I was Rob. We still buy fruit from that vineyard as well. And at one point, we bought fruit from both sides of the hill, and the east side where we all are now is what inevitably ended up in our single vineyard designate wine. So I think the good news for us is we ended up on the correct side of the hill at the end of the day, and that east facing slope is really a special place.
Yeah, and I think the morning sun aspect really affects that. It dries out the vineyard, but it keeps it cooler, really.
So what is it about people from Boston, Bill, heading to that neighborhood?
There's a point at which apparently in about middle age where we just lose our minds.
Oh, yeah. Well, anybody starting a vineyard, could be accused of that at some point. David Paige. Yeah. Yes, I'm looking right at you, Dave Paige. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh, he's hitting middle age?
Yeah. Oh, he's past it, Rob. He's past it, definitely. So
come on, Rob, you could have just left it there and I would have taken it.
That is really a dear story, and it's so great to hear that Vivian is still doing so well. It's a beautiful spot up there, and the view from there is just absolutely tremendous, as we all know. So that was really sweet, Rob. Thank you so much. And we're going to move on to Ben Casteel, and Ben, what's this French name, Ben? You're gonna make us all have to twist our La 19e French tongues this morning. So delighted to introduce Ben Casteel. Actually, Ben doesn't need much introduction here as a second gen, and he grew up on that piece of property. What we didn't hear from Rob is all those stories about when you were 2 years old. But we'll get to those. So Ben, you are lot number 77.
Yeah, well, hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. It's great to be on a call. A couple of people I've known for a very long time. Gary worked with my dad and with me when I got drug into the winery to help label and bottle and, hopefully not make anything. And Rob's known me, as he said, for a very, very long time. We spent every Easter with the Stuarts that I can remember for my entire childhood and most of my adulthood. So very happy to be here. You guys are making me very nostalgic talking about Warden Hill Road. I used to work at Rex Hill, who was very deeply invested in Warden Hill Road, buying grapes from Weber Vineyard and Marsh. And it's a special place. It's one of the places I think in the Willamette Valley that definitely does have a thumbprint that those wines, when you smell them, they smell like they come from a place. And I got to work with them very early in my career, and it's still sort of my phantom limb. I still sort of feel it, even though I'm down in the Eola Hills now where I grew up. So the vineyard that's behind, nicely backlit behind me, was planted by my parents and my aunt and my uncle in 1977 to 79. Originally 52 acres that we've now grown. We've purchased Justice Vineyard, which was owned by my aunt and my uncle. It's 27 additional acres. And then our neighbor's vineyard, Lumen, we bought last June, which is about 20-ish. So we're 100% estate. We've converted to 100% organic viticulture. Eugenia told a very happy story of 2019. It is definitely an all's well that ends well. I don't remember it going quite that well here. I mean, it's, 2020 removed, it's probably the most challenging growing season we've ever seen. Lots of humidity, lots of disease pressure. But again, a vintage that was sort of a callback to, as my uncle likes to call it, the margin of viticulture. You get grapes as ripe as you were able to, as opposed to as ripe as you want to. And it was a return to form that I was very happy to see. It didn't feel that way at the time, but the resulting wines are pure, they're graceful, they're a lot of what I remember from a decade past. So La 19e, Pat came up with the name. It's the 19th vintage, 19th leaf for these vines. Pat and I, my aunt, my dear aunt, who's the president of our company, we sort of trade off who names the wine year in and year out. So it's as usual, it's sort of, I hold the nail and Pat swings the hammer. So that's how we came up with the name. It's the youngest producing part of our property. I, in a lot of ways, I was, I am and was very fortunate. When I started making the wine at Bethel Heights in 2005, I was 27 years old. The vines here were also 27 years old. I wasn't tasked with coming up with a bunch of wines. The sort of pedigreed parts of the vineyard had already been decided on. We have a lot of block designations. Gary was there during that time. The flat block, the southeast block, the west block. It wasn't really winemaking for that. It was more editing. Like the barrels that we had, it was more just, okay, this works and this doesn't fit, so we take that one out. These vines I sort of got to grow up with in my career at Bethel Heights. 2005 was, I think, just the third leaf. It's the highest elevation part of our property. I remember saying to my uncle, who's our longtime grape grower, Ted Casteel, sort of, I thought profoundly in 2010, 2011, I'm like, Ted, this looks like it should be the best part of the vineyard. And Ted said, well, yeah, Ben, we always thought that, catch up. Yeah. So it sits above the flat block and above the southeast block. It's 3 different clones. What I did with this wine, I'd gone to a tasting a year or 2 ago. Like all good ideas, I stole it. It was Jean-Louis Chave did a tasting, and of course, they work with 3 different soil types. And when people were asking, it's kind of one house, one wine, how do you do it? He's like, well, each soil type is going to be a little bit more or less successful in a given vintage. So we start where we had the most success, and we build around that. And that's what I did with this wine. This comes from the steepest part of our property. It's not very creatively named, the steep slope. Most things at Bethel Heights are not very creatively named. The flat block is flat. The southeast block falls to the southeast, and you can guess where the west block is. So Pommard planted in 2002 with a little bit of 777, also planted in 2000. So yeah, that's the wine.
That was a very funny comment you made about the hammer and the nail. And I intend to hold on to that one. That was just, that's one of those things you just cherish forever, that you just get a little tidbits you get along the way. So thank you for that, Ben. That was really fun. Next up, oh yes, our newest vintner in a way, well, certainly newest on this panel, but he's certainly been around and has earned his stripes. And it's very exciting to have Dave Paige on this panel, speaking about David Paige wines. That's just congratulations, Dave, your own vineyard, your own winery now, you're in the middle of construction. It's a very, very exciting time, and it's not overdue, but it's really lovely to see it happening and finally doing all that on your own. So Dave, tell us a little bit about why you did this.
Well, thank you. Yes, I am the new guy in the valley. Well, as you pointed out earlier, Eugenia, I'm going to say, approaching middle age when I was having been at Adelsheim for 17 vintages. And I apparently got inflicted with the same badness that Bill Sweat referred to earlier.
It's called the vintner virus. It's called the vintner virus.
Something, whatever it is, I didn't get cured of it fast enough, and decided that I was at a point where you know, I was tremendously proud of all that time at Adelsheim. I mean, you don't spend 17 years in the same place unless you're pretty proud of what you're doing and pretty happy with what you're doing. But I was at a point where it was either do something new or possibly be in danger of kind of getting stale, you know, and not knowing what you're going to do next. So I opted to do this, and for the record, I tried really hard to name it anything other than David Paige Wines, but my partners and I couldn't settle on any other name, and so I got dragged into that. And I'm really grateful that you, Eugenia, summed up 2019 and and everybody else has talked about what kind of a season it was. Because honestly, to me, 2019 was the year that I bought a vineyard with some partners. We came up with our label design, bottled our first vintage, and moved from one winery to another. And I couldn't have told you off the top of my head what the weather was that year. That was not that was not going to come to me if you'd asked. So it's been quite a ride, been a lot of fun, and tremendously honored to you know, one good thing about being older in this business or being around in this business for a long time is that even when you start something new, you can get invited to things like this, and I'm very honored for that. The wine that I brought is we call it Second Wind because it's a blend of Wind Ridge Vineyard on Ribbon Ridge and what they call the Black Hole Vineyard, which is Lecado's estate vineyard. And sorry, as you saw earlier, my dog really wants attention. No. So we, you're really going to do this now? We talked about what to name something that was a combination of Wind Ridge and Black Hole, and came up with a lot of sort of not safe for work suggestions, and ended up Second Wind made sense because this is my second career in the Willamette Valley, and it's also the second vintage we made. And I'm just going to keep going in spite of what's going on beside me, because I cannot stop that from happening. I apologize.
It would not be preview with dog cameos.
Yeah, as Julia said, yeah, we got to have a dog cameo. We haven't any kid cameos yet, so you know the day is definitely young, definitely young. Well, we are going to actually finish up with what I'm going to call the almost senior citizen here, Mr. Horner. Yeah. It is true. We are the old farts on the call today. But you know what that means, Gary? That means that we are the wisest on the call as well. So we're going to just take the honorarium of age and turn it into the sages of the Willamette Valley here. And I love the fact that you have your Erath sweatshirt on.
Right.
Just in case anybody forgot what was going on. But you have, and if anybody's keeping tabs here, and I'm going to introduce Gary as lot number 80, lot number 79, if you were counting, is a Chardonnay lot. And that would have been discussed on the very, very first call on Monday morning. So Gary, lot number 80, Marvel.
Marvel. Well, let me touch on the name first. And I don't know how many of you out there remember the actor Fernando Lamas. He was like active in the 40s and into the 70s. Eugenia does. Look at that. She's on her head. Anyway, this guy was Argentinian, and being Argentinian, and he was actually a really famous guy. He sort of spoke like he had marbles in his mouth, you know, a really deep voice. And I was watching, it was either the Tonight Show or Saturday Night Live somewhere back in the 80s. And Billy Crystal was on the show and did an interpretation. What's the background noise coming through? Something weird is going on there. Anyway, Billy Crystal did an imitation of Fernando Lamas and a line that he had in a movie in the 40s. And the phrase was, apparently Lamas had noticed a love interest and said to this love interest, "You look marvelous, darling, simply marvelous." So don't ask me why, but ever since, when I'm putting together wine blends, and I do a lot of that stuff in my kitchen, all bench trials and stuff, and I hit on something that's like, that's the ticket right there. Love it. Can't do any better than that. I mumble to myself, marvelous, darling. Simply marvelous. I know it's dumb. That's why it's called marble. So it's actually a marble. And the wine itself, the fruit comes from a vineyard down in the Eola Amity Hills that we own called Willakaya. That vineyard is huge. It's 300 acres, but there's 120 acres of planted vines, mostly Pinot Noir. There are 48 individual blocks, and you want to talk about a complicated puzzle, that's it right now. And there's 48 blocks because there are really 48 different sections in terms of aspect, elevation, soil composition, you name it. And it rises anywhere from 300 feet up to 860 feet. So this particular wine comes from a block 37, which is about 2/3 of the way up the slope. It's all 667 clone, which was planted in 2005. And there's a sliver within this block that is like extra rocky. And every year it produces this really tiny berries and a great deal of concentration and color. And normally what I've done for this wine, the barrel auction wine, is I've used a little more of a delicate selection from mid-slope of 777. But I thought when I came across this thing, it's like a total reversal of what we normally offer up. So I'm excited about it. It's kind of got broad shoulders, being 667. There's a little more tannin you're going to notice in there, and also being on a rocky soil, there's going to be a bit more tannin in intensity. And one thing we found, like I think a lot of other people, Eugenia and a few others touched on it, in 2019, we had a couple of those rain events, but it cooled down. In fact, in September, we had temperatures that were more like temperatures normally are in October. We had the 6th wettest September on record. So all of us Oregon winemaker type are kind of used to dealing with curveballs. You never know. And this was sort of a curveball, but it turned out to be absolutely perfect because what happened is it cooled down and we didn't find ourselves having to harvest in a hot situation. And the prior vintages, it's like, man, it's like 80 degrees, 90 degrees, got wind, things are dehydrating, blah, blah, blah. This was the reversal. So we had a nice amount of hang time. But temperatures when we harvested this fruit, and that was like towards the end of September, it was in the 50s. Mm-hmm. So there was no hurry up to pick. It was, okay, let's take our time and see where this goes and how it develops. So we got lucky. And the entire vineyard, I think we picked it from the 25th through maybe halfway into October. Mm-hmm. And the challenge in a cool, wet vintage, as we've all been through, is we had a little bit of rain early in September. And then once that happens, if you're not a grower that has been around for a while, if you're not a grower, if you're a grower that cuts corners, perhaps, just to save a little money, you have to, in Oregon, be prepared for the very worst scenario every year, and it may not happen. But when it does, you're going to be able to tolerate rain events and dry out and avoid or at least minimize rot risks. And this is one of those situations. So we saw the weather coming, a little hit of moisture early in September, then a more significant hit in the 3rd week. And then you start seeing a little bit of detritus starting to show up in some low areas, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a huge amount of threat that was out there that, you guys, you would have no idea that's going on. But everybody on this panel has had the experience that we kind of know how to respond to it, because we've seen everything from the hottest vintages to cool and wet and everything in between. So I'm really happy with this wine. It was in barrel for 15 months. And normally with something like this, we ferment in small 2-ton open top fermenters. It's pretty basic. And voila. Anything else? Did you?
And voila. Yeah, I think the challenge I remember in that vintage was trying to help the vineyard crew remember that I know that the clusters are all falling apart and I know they look like hell, but I don't care what they look like. I only care what they taste like. At the end of the day, you don't ever see those clusters falling apart. So it was no, leave it, leave it, leave it. And to your point, Gary, it was so cool that we could literally, even though the clusters were starting to get a little saggy, we could really sit there and wait for ripe flavors under this cool environment. So of course the acids were beautifully retained, and these wines are so elegant. They've got this incredible depth of mid palate, but they're beautifully light on their feet. And I don't think that we've done our job of descriptors. So I would like to quickly go backwards, and that starts with you, Gary, and just give us your 2 or 3 sentences on that particular wine, aromatics, mouth, you know the drill.
Yeah, you know the drill. A little more dark fruit here. It's a little more of a broader shouldered tannin presence. It has great length of flavor that's supported by the acidity that's in this wine. And this wine, post malolactic fermentation, almost has white wine pHs, which I actually love. I like a fair amount of acid in all my wines, and certainly in Pinot Noir. This wine, for the site's normally a little big, is fairly round for that site. Oak is minimal. Try to avoid overpowering the fruit with oak. And I find that once you push the boundary a little bit, the aromatics of the fruit tend to get a bit suppressed. So it's kind of a balancing act. But yeah, this wine will lay down forever. That's how I feel, at least 20 years.
Yeah, I think that we'll see that on the 19s. Dave, maybe your dog could help us with a little bit of just dog descriptors.
She's pretty one note on the whole thing, actually, but fortunately she's outside now. I appreciate coming back to this, since obviously I didn't really get to talk about the wine earlier. What I love about the Wind Ridge Vineyard and Ribbon Ridge in general is that it confounds me when it comes time to talk about the fruit, in terms of that I go back and forth. Is it more red fruited or black fruited or even blue fruited? And it does that kind of year in, year out. I always feel like it really straddles that fence in a way that's delightfully confusing, especially for a wine that has such strong fruit tones to it. You would think you would land on a more clear descriptor by now. And that excites me when a wine does that, where I have to come back and think, what does that taste like exactly? For this wine, in blending it with the Black Hole Vineyard, my concern is that if you have something that's already doing something so tantalizing, you don't want to lose that in a blend and have it become more muddled. But I felt like the Black Hole Vineyard really kind of adds a little bit darker earth, darker spice, and kind of a wet stone to that. And the structures combine well. It kind of adds a little more solid structure to it even. And so I really found that blended very well together. And that's the kind of thing you don't know until you try it, because when you really like one wine, sometimes you just want to leave it alone. But this was an exciting blend to work on. And we have our own vineyard in the Eola Amity Hills, and I'm excited about that site too. But this just came about in 2019, and it was so fun. That's why I wanted to show this.
Boy, Dave, if you didn't put the dilemma of a single vineyard versus a blend right in front of us there, with the comment of, focus on one hand and blending potentially being a muddle, but are you building other parts that are missing in the single vineyard? So yeah, that is just one of the all-time day-to-day dilemmas that you have to work through.
And I
When
do
does it
think,
work
you
better
have to be,
together?
right. And I think you have to be careful with that. I think you always have to make sure you're adding something if you're gonna, but you know, I'm small enough now, I can play around with any idea that I want. So that's how that came about.
Yes, all of your decisions now are your own commercial decisions. So it's liberating. It's terrifying and liberating all at one time is that's the way I remember it. Ben, I think if I've got the reverse order correct, you're up next.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, Eugenia, to hear you talk about acidity retention for 2019, and Claire can probably relate to what I'm about ready to say. Acidity for us is only ever a problem if we have too much. It's never that we don't have enough in my little neighborhood. So it wasn't so much that we were waiting for flavors to develop or sugar to accumulate in 2019. We were mainly just kind of waiting for our acidity to go down, which mercifully it did because, you know, the season sort of extended for us. You know, I think, you know, 2018, 2017, the sort of hyperbole machine has already churned out everything it needs to with, you know, best vintage ever talk. I think in 10 to 15 years, we're going to look back at 2019 as debatably the best of the three. I think it's in the best natural balance. You know, I hesitate to call wines delicate because they're not. I think they're slightly lighter in body, a little bit more lysine, and I think probably will take a little more time to reveal themselves. But I love them for their purity, their singularity, their elegance. I think it's going to be a tremendous vintage.
And some flavor descriptors or something? I know that's...
yeah, I hate tasting notes.
Can you do that?
Other things, but I'll do my best. I mean, I think, you know, I get a lot of... It's sort of the tea version of whatever fresh fruit you want to say. So that's sort of like raspberry tea. I mean, I think it sort of plays to what Rob said, that sort of forest floor, savory character to go with the fruit. It's always in conjunction. So I caught myself making tea references to the point that my assistant winemaker told me to stop when we were blending up the 2019. And so I think I'll stop right there.
Well, I know in 18...
I agree with you, Ben. I think it's in the tannins too. They're very tea-like tannins.
Yeah. It, I was 18 was of course just the opposite of all that, and which makes this really a fun back-to-back, particularly for preview, since this group of people, our audience, has done a lot of tasting of the 18s, presumably last year, and to move to 19. And if it isn't a refresher on the beauty of the Willamette Valley, where every vintage is its own statement. It's, I think, one of still the greatest pleasures of making wine here is that every year, Gary used the word curveball, every year we get something and you just kind of wait for it to come and hope you have your bat in the right position, ready to hit, or your mitt in the right position, whichever it is. Rob, you gave us a few odds and ends. Any other descriptors that you'd like to add to your wine?
Well, for me, distinctively, year after year, cold vintage, hot vintage, wet vintage, dry vintage, Weber has this tamarind, nutmeg, ginger component. And I'm a big advocate of not having new oak. In fact, I buy like 2 or 3 new barrels from Gillet every year. I have a standing agreement with Christum that we get 50 of their 5-year-old ones every year. And I feel thankful to Christum because they're seizing those barrels just right. So I'm a big proponent that I really want to show what the vineyards are producing and not what the barrel's producing. And I think it was Gary was touching on that as well. And so Weber, I can pick it out. It's always tamarind, nutmeg, ginger. And then there's some tannins there, but not overwhelmingly. And dark fruits, and sometimes you get like the roses that actually have aromatics these days. You get that sort of rose component.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's lovely. That's lovely.
And I did, you know, my term, Gary, is the yellow brick road. And every day you walk out, you open your door, and if you go right, you have a beautiful wine, and if you go left, you have flying monkeys. So that's what the harvest.
I'm going to use that.
Yeah, and we're going to ask you every day. So, Rob, what kind of day is it? Right path day or a left path day? Yeah, we get those. Bill, descriptors. What would Robert Britton say about this wine?
Oh my gosh. You know, Robert's so hypercritical of you know, the work we do here. It's always a challenge, but I think he likes this wine a lot. I'm going to back up just half a step to add some context I left out before. So Winderlea is now farming 65 acres on 3 sites, biodynamic. This wine comes from our home estate vineyard on Warden Hill Road, which is 18 acres, Pinot, 16.5 acres of Pinot Noir and an acre and a half of Chardonnay, and which we've been farming biodynamic since '09 and has been certified since 2015. And like Brooks, we're also certified at the winery as well. This, you know, when I think of the Dundee Hills, I always think of like high tone red fruit, and I think this vineyard has some of that, but we also skew much more towards black fruits. And so this wine, I think especially aromatically, it has a really lovely brioche character that I'm enjoying, peppercorn and black cherry. And then in the mouth, I think you get a bit of strawberry, but really more so kind of ripe plum and black cherry with a kind of mushroom tart base note. And the structure, I think, is really the bright entry. It feels very vibrant to me. And has silky tannins and a long finish. You know, this is based on the two of the oldest blocks in the vineyard, but as Dave Paige pointed out, that little bit, that favorite barrel from Block 9, which we share with Adelsheim, which I think really added a really nice texture and length to the finished wine. And so we're kind of excited. And I'll just finish by saying, for Gary, since he used, his wine is on the Black Hole Vineyard, I think it was Tom Mortimer who said to me early on about farming and making wine in the Willamette Valley, is that it's a lot like college basketball. Everything happens in the last 2 minutes.
That's great. And Claire, we're going to come all the way back around and finish up with you. And if you could tell us a little bit about that wine in terms of, flavor, acid, aroma, all those important things.
Well, I kind of set out to make this blend really in a similar approach that Dave was talking about. And I had a component that I really remember as far back as just tasting it out of the press pan after fermentation and noticing this salinity that was present. And I loved it. And I was really excited and lit up about it and hoped that would carry on in the finished wine. And it did. And so really sort of thought about, well, maybe we just stop there. I'm really enjoying this. This is a fun blend, or it's a fun component, and let's do it on its own. These are old vines. They're really unique and interesting. But then I sort of thought, well, maybe there's some other options that we can blend in that might add to it. And so what I found was that some younger vine, I think 06 planted 115 from Carl Muska's place across the street, really added structure, supported those flavors, and also rounded out the palate, added a bit of fruit and a lot of length. And so it did, I think, improve the wine overall and give it more complexity and just sort of a savory finish that I really loved overall. So this wine has kind of the best of both worlds for me. It has that sort of bright vibrancy and like fruitiness that I love off of younger vine sites, but it's got this acidity. It has restraint that I think that comes from older vine sites. And ultimately, I think it's a little bit savory. And I love that about the duality of the wine.
Yeah, so that was a little bit to the Dave Paige theory of, if you can add it, if it enhances and if it's good. And it sounds like that's exactly what happened in your blending trials, was that that other vineyard really did enhance your final blend. And the thing that's so amazing, of course, is there are 1,000 options when you get on that on the bench. I mean, it's one of the hardest things to do is to focus and every day, and 2 hours or 3 hours later, the wines have opened up and are different anyway. So, the exercise you started 3 hours ago may not actually be the exercise that gets you to the final blend. So it is one of the more fun things to do, although it can be a little frustrating at the same time. Well, I can't wait to taste these wines next week because they sound delicious. And again, as I said early on, one of the great pleasures is they're all from one vintage. And so it's really a treat. I remember that was Salud every year, that we would come in and we were focused on one vintage. So it really allowed you to go around the room and get the most incredible sense of that vintage. And since all of these wines are really the very most special things in our cellar, whether they're single vineyards or blends, these are one-offs. These are not things that we do annually for our commercial enterprises. And so it's just this glorious focus on the best of the best out of the best sellers, and it really capsulizes a single vintage, which always to me helps me focus when tasting. We're sort of getting to the top of our hour here, and comments or Julia, are there questions in the chat that we should? The questions may have all been done over, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
Yeah, it's true. No questions from the audience at this point, unless the panelists have any questions for each other. I certainly always have questions, but I want to defer to you guys for a moment.
I have an anecdote.
Yes.
So Ben's dad, Terry, gave me my first job down here in the Valley in 1988, working a harvest. And there was a basketball hoop that was on the crush pad, and I don't remember how old you were, Ben, but Ben would sucker me into playing, oh, let's play a game of horse, and just kick my butt every time. But I'm glad we didn't put money on it, because I would have been cleaned out. So
I didn't have it anyway, so it didn't matter.
that's right. I'd take your allowance. So that's the anecdote. But one story I tell everybody is that 4 years that I spent at Bethel Heights was the most valuable experience I've ever had in terms of a learning experience, because that family basically opened their doors to me and tolerated me. They had to be patient with me, because I came down from Seattle and I was just like a great nut, and I was all excited, and Terry would pat me on the back, go, oh, that's nice. But 4 years later, I look back and I was so lucky to have had that, and still owe those folks a great thanks.
Gary, Kate Ayers, who's our winemaker at Penerash, who will be on the panel later today, she had the same experience at Bethel Heights, and it completely set her up for winemaking success, not just in the Willamette Valley, but probably anywhere, because you learn not just the tactical details of what you have in front of you, but the strategic approach to winemaking, to a family business. And so Bethel Heights has been one of the training grounds. There are a dozen of those wineries that have pushed out many of our winemakers over these years, and we can't thank them enough for that, because they learn in the tradition of the Willamette Valley, and that's as important as learning the techniques and strategy of what we do. So, Julia, any comments or thoughts before we wrap this up? Do you have a pithy question for the end?
Eugenia, that did make me think of something that I wanted to ask this group, just out of the amazing kind of spectrum of cool experience that everyone has here. What do you think has changed the most about the way that you approach wine over your career, in terms of whether it's your picking decisions or something you do with tannin or oxygen, anything like that? What do you think has changed the most about you since you started making wine?
Open question.
Don't overthink it. I mean, while you've got a toolbox to work with, at some point you need to take an action. That's just it. And I find that if I start overthinking things and then I get out of the zone, that's just my comment.
Rob, Dave, Ben, Claire?
For me, it was a hard lesson to learn, but I think of all the tools that you have as a wine grower, winemaker, the sort of hardest one for me to wrap my head around was patience and time. Sort of to what Gary said. I mean, a lot of the things that people try to sell you in a bag will happen with enough time. And I think, we all, sort of the fervor of harvest, you sort of, that there's an after effect to that you sort of feel like you need to be doing something all the time, when what the wine really needs to be doing is sitting in a barrel and doing exactly what it's doing, and be left alone to do what it's going to do, and not be meddled with. And that was a lesson hard learned for me. I mean, I really wanted to raise quality and affect change at Bethel Heights. And I think I realized that in all of my attempting to raise the bar, I was being far more meddlesome than I probably needed to be, and putting my fingerprints all over things that didn't require my fingerprints to be all over them. So, to Gary's point, I think at some point you do need to take an action, but that action does not need to be constant.
That's very good advice.
Or I would add, or that action also doesn't need to be predetermined, you know. Just be ready, especially during harvest when things really are changing from day to day, to learn to be ready to go taste or smell a fermenter that you think you already know what's happening with it, and have a completely different perception today than you had yesterday, and change your mind about what you're doing. Not because you're overthinking it, you know, to Gary's point, but because you just collected a new data point, and whatever you thought you were going to do might not be relevant anymore.
Mhm. So I love the fact that you're all giving free advice to all the budding winemakers on this call, but I couldn't agree more that not overreacting and taking a deep breath. We feel like we need to act, but if you've got wonderful grapes and great farming, they should probably carry you through whatever set of circumstances Mother Nature has handed you, and she certainly loves to do that. Any other comments before we wrap up Lucky 13? It's been a real treat to have you all here today, share this hour together. Final leg of preview week. All right, Julia.
Eugenia,
Yes,
thank
Rob.
you for hurting us.
Yeah,
Yes,
Julia did the hurting. I know better than to try to get you guys together.
Well, I do want to
Thanks,
thank
both of you.
Eugenia for being an amazing moderator. Thank you all panelists for your wisdom and all of your great stories today, and for your wine. And thank you to our attendees for joining us, and we'll see you in the next session. Cheers, everybody.
Yep, and we look forward to seeing many of you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.